On the morning of October 14, 2009, Detective Ray Colburn's wife called the Riverside County Sheriff's Department to report her own husband as a dangerous cult member, and nobody at the department told her she was wrong. By the time anyone understood the full scope of what Ray Colburn had been doing for the previous 22 months, he had vanished from the cult's compound in the San Jacinto Mountains, vanished from the department's records, and vanished from the life of a family who had stopped recognizing the man sleeping in their house long before he stopped coming home. What you're about to hear is the story of an undercover operation so deep, so consuming, and so catastrophically mismanaged that it destroyed the man it was built around, and left behind a question that nobody in Riverside County's law enforcement hierarchy has ever answered on the record. Did anyone actually know where Ray Colburn was when he disappeared, or had they simply stopped looking? To understand how a decorated detective ends up reported missing by both his own department and the organization he was sent to destroy, you have to go back to January 2008. Back to a striplit conference room on the third floor of the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, where a whiteboard covered in photographs and red string had been standing untouched for 11 days because the detective originally assigned to the case had requested reassignment, which, in 17 years on the force, he had never once done before. The case file was labeled internally as Operation Hollow Crown. The subject was a group calling itself the Covenant of the Purified Remnant, a name so deliberately biblical it almost obscured how recently the organization had been constructed. Founded in 2004 by a man named David Elias Pruitt, the Covenant had begun as what most people in Hemet, California assumed was just another evangelical splinter group. Pruitt held meetings in the back room of a health food store on Florida Avenue. He spoke quietly. He dressed plainly. He smiled with the kind of patient, unhurried warmth that people who have been genuinely loved often find unsettling when they encounter it in a stranger. By 2006, the health food store was gone, and so was the veneer of normalcy. The Covenant had purchased 43 acres of land in the San Jacinto Mountains, outside a small, largely forgotten community called Anza, California, sitting at about 4,000 feet elevation in a landscape that is beautiful in the way that isolation is always beautiful, vast, silent, and indifferent to whether you survive it. The compound had no official name. Members called it the Clearing. Pruitt himself was 41 years old in 2008. Former seminary student. Former pharmaceutical sales representative. 2 prior restraining orders, one filed by an ex-girlfriend in San Bernardino County in 1999, one filed on behalf of a minor in Kern County in 2003, the details of which remain sealed. He stood 6'2", kept his hair close-cropped, and by all accounts had the kind of physical stillness in conversation that made people feel he was listening harder than anyone had ever listened to them before. One former member, interviewed by a county social worker in late 2007, described sitting across from Pruitt in his office at the Clearing and feeling, she said, like the room had no walls. Like the conversation was happening somewhere outside of ordinary time. She said it like it was a compliment. She said it 18 months after she had fled the compound on foot, in February, with no shoes. The sheriff's department had been building a file on Pruitt since mid-2007, following the disappearance of a 26-year-old woman named Claire Ostrander, originally from Redlands, who had joined the Covenant in the spring of that year and whose parents had not heard from her since the previous November. She was not the first name in the file. She was just the one whose father happened to know a county commissioner. And what was inside that file, the full picture of what the department suspected was happening behind the fence line at the Clearing, was disturbing enough that it had already caused one experienced detective to walk into his supervisor's office and say, quietly, that he would rather lose his pension than set foot on that property. That was the file they handed to Ray Colburn. Ray Colburn was 38 years old, 14 years on the force, commendations in 2003 and 2006, a wife named Patricia, 2 daughters aged 9 and 11. He coached his older daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard he'd been meaning to fix since 2005. He was, by every measure available to the department, stable, grounded, exactly the kind of man you could trust to go somewhere dark and find his way back out. His supervisor, Lieutenant Dennis Hargrove, would later tell an internal review board that when Colburn agreed to take the assignment, he seemed, in Hargrove's word, eager. That detail has never stopped being troubling. The plan, as it was originally constructed, was straightforward in the way that only people who have never done undercover work believe anything is straightforward. Colburn would establish a cover identity. James Keeler, recently divorced, recently relocated from Tucson, Arizona, spiritually searching, and make contact with the Covenant's known recruitment channels, which at that point included a website, a public lecture series held monthly at a rented space in Hemet, and 3 current members who operated what Pruitt called outreach ministries in the surrounding communities. The operation was projected to last 4 to 6 months. Colburn would document financial crimes, potential coercion, evidence related to Claire Ostrander's disappearance, and report back through a handler contact every 72 hours using a protocol they had taken, almost without modification, from a 1990s DEA playbook that had been designed for narcotics infiltration and had never once been tested on a high-control religious group. Nobody flagged that as a problem at the time. That fact alone should keep you awake at night. Colburn attended his first Covenant public lecture on February 9, 2008, a Saturday evening, in a rented function room above a Mexican restaurant on State Street in Hemet. He wore jeans and a gray flannel shirt. He left his wedding ring at home for the first time in 12 years. He sat in the 3rd row, and he listened to David Elias Pruitt speak for 90 minutes about purity, about the corruption of the modern world, about the particular loneliness of people who sense they were made for something that the ordinary world has no framework to contain. Colburn's first contact report, filed the following Tuesday, was 4 paragraphs long. Procedural. Measured. He noted Pruitt's rhetorical techniques, the room's layout, the approximate number of attendees, the demographics. He noted that 2 individuals had approached him after the lecture and taken his contact details. His second contact report 3 weeks later was 11 pages. Something had changed. Everyone who later read that report in the context of everything that followed agreed on that point. The tone was different. The language was different. He was still filing. He was still, on the surface, Detective Ray Colburn, badge number 2247, conducting a documented undercover operation. But there was something in those 11 pages, a certain quality of attention, a certain texture to the way he described Pruitt's voice, the atmosphere at the clearing during his first visit, the feeling, his word, of coherence, that made at least one person in that department deeply uneasy. That person was his handler, Sergeant Diane Morell. And the note she attached to the back of his second contact report, a note that would not be discovered until nearly 3 years later, read as follows. I don't think he's losing the cover. I think he's losing the distance. She filed it. She said nothing to Hargrove. She told the review board later that she had convinced herself she was overreacting. For months passed, then 8, then 12. The operation's projected timeline had long since been abandoned. Colburn was embedded. He was living at the clearing 2 weeks out of every 4. Patricia Colburn, Ray's wife, had been told only that her husband was on an extended undercover assignment. No details, no timeline, standard protocol. She was managing 2 children, a mortgage, and a husband who, on the weekends he did come home, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the walls. She told her sister that he smelled different. That's the detail that lodges in you. Not that he seemed distant, not that he was changed, though those things were also true. She said that when he came through the door, there was something about the way he smelled, wood smoke and something else, something she couldn't name, something that reminded her of the word consecrated, even though she was not, she said, a particularly religious woman. She said it like she was embarrassed by the word, like she knew it sounded strange, like she couldn't think of any other one that fit. By the spring of 2009, Ray Colburn was filing his contact reports once a month instead of every 72 hours. Morell was flagging the gaps. Hargrove was not responding to her flags. And somewhere on 43 acres of mountain land outside Anza, California, a man who had driven a Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard and coached Saturday morning soccer was learning to answer to a different name. And then, on the night of September 28, 2009, Claire Ostrander's name appeared again. Not in a missing persons update, not in a departmental memo. In Colburn's contact report. 3 words, buried in the middle of a paragraph about property boundaries and a new structure being built in the northeast corner of the clearing. 3 words that should have triggered an immediate extraction. Nobody acted on them for 16 days. Those 3 words were, she is here. That's it. No punctuation. No elaboration. Buried in the 14th line of a field report that Sergeant Diane Morell didn't open until the morning of October 1, 2009, because the report had been sitting in a shared departmental inbox that 3 different people were theoretically monitoring and that, in practice, nobody had checked in 11 days. Claire Ostrander, the 26-year-old woman from Redlands whose disappearance had launched Operation Hollow Crown, whose father's connection to a county commissioner had turned a file from a rumor into a case, had been on that compound the entire time. 22 months of infiltration. And the detective sent to find evidence of her had found her. And then the system designed to receive that information had simply failed to receive it in time for it to matter. Morell flagged it immediately. She called Hargrove's direct line at 7:43 in the morning, and she used the word extraction 3 times in under 2 minutes. Hargrove told her to write it up formally, and he would review it that afternoon. He reviewed it 4 days later. By then, Colburn had filed nothing further. The 72-hour check-in protocol, already a ghost of itself by this point, had produced silence. Morell tried the emergency contact number, a burner phone Colburn carried under his cover identity, the one piece of tradecraft they had maintained with any consistency. It rang out. She tried again the following morning. It rang out again. On the 3rd attempt, someone picked up and said nothing, and the line was open for approximately 8 seconds before the call ended, and Morell would later describe those 8 seconds to the review board in a voice so controlled you could hear the effort it was taking to keep it that way. She said she could hear wind. High-altitude wind, the kind that doesn't sound like city wind, doesn't sound like freeway noise, sounds like something geological, she said. Like the mountain breathing. Then the line went dead. It was October 5, 2009. 9 days before Patricia Colburn would call the Riverside County Sheriff's Department to report her husband as a dangerous cult member. 9 days in which the department's response to a potentially compromised undercover detective on a known high-control compound with a sealed juvenile record in the file was, and this requires a moment to absorb, to do nothing that generated a paper trail. Hargrove would later characterize this period as an assessment phase. The review board would later characterize Hargrove's characterization as, in their formal language, inadequate to the circumstances. In the language of anyone without a legal obligation to be diplomatic. They left him there. But here is where the story stops being about institutional failure, though it is absolutely still about that, and starts being about something that is harder to name and, in some ways, considerably more disturbing. Because while Morell was filing flags that Hargrove wasn't reading, and while Patricia Colburn was watching her husband become a stranger in increments so gradual she couldn't point to the exact moment it had happened, something else had been unfolding at the clearing. Something that Colburn had been documenting partially, obliquely, in the fragmented reports that did make it through for months. And it concerned not just what David Elias Pruitt was doing to the people inside that compound, but what he appeared to know about the man he was doing it to. Colburn's report from August 14, 2009, one of only 2 reports filed that month, contained a passage that the review board would return to repeatedly, that Morell said she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. It read, **, he used the name Colburn today, not Keeler, Colburn, in a group setting. He said it quietly, almost parenthetically, in the middle of a passage about the masks that broken men wear when they are sent to shepherds' fields as wolves and are instead converted by the grass. Nobody else reacted. I don't know if they knew. I don't know how he knows. I have not broken protocol. I have checked every access point. I am writing this down because I need to record that I am still Ray Colburn, badge number 2247, and I am still on assignment, and I want to be clear, I am not confused about who I am. *. The repetition was the thing. The insistence. You write I am not confused that many times in a single paragraph, and you have already told the reader everything they are afraid to conclude. Pruitt knew. By mid-August at the very latest, Pruitt knew he had a law enforcement officer living on his compound under a false name, and his response was not to expel him, not to confront him directly, not to alert members. His response was to say the man's real name out loud in a group setting, like planting a flag, and then continue speaking as though nothing had happened. As though the revelation was not a threat but a gift. As though what he was offering Ray Colburn was something the department never had, the chance to be known completely and still be welcomed. That is the specific texture of what David Elias Pruitt did. And it is important to hold on to it, because it explains something about the 16 days between Colburn's last report and his disappearance that no bureaucratic failure fully accounts for. It explains why a 14-year veteran with commendations and a cracked dashboard in Saturday morning soccer didn't pick up his emergency burner phone and say "get me out." It explains why Patricia Colburn's first clue that something had gone catastrophically wrong was not a call from the department, but a conversation with her older daughter, who said she didn't think James was coming back. James. Not Dad. Not Ray. James. Her 11-year-old daughter had started calling her father by his cover name. And when Patricia asked her why, the girl said carefully the way children say things they're not sure are allowed. She said that he'd asked her to. But nothing could have prepared the department for what Sergeant Morell found when she finally convinced Hargrove to authorize a physical approach to the clearing on the morning of October 9th. 5 days before Patricia made her call. 5 days before any of this became a matter of record rather than a matter of avoided paperwork. Morell drove up herself. She parked on the fire road and walked the last quarter-mile to the compound's main gate, which was standing open. Not unlocked, not ajar, but fully open, swung wide, in a way that on a property that had been described in every field report for 22 months as obsessively secured felt less like an invitation and more like a message. The compound was not empty. There were people there. 30, perhaps 35, going about the morning's routines, cooking, maintenance, what appeared to be a structured group session happening in the open-sided structure in the central yard. Morell showed her badge at the gate and asked to speak with David Elias Pruitt. The man she'd asked looked at her badge for a long moment, then looked at her face and said, in a tone that she described as genuinely regretful, that Brother Pruitt was unavailable. She asked about James Keeler. The man said he didn't know that name. She asked about Ray Colburn. And the man's expression changed. Not toward alarm, not toward guilt. Toward something she struggled to describe accurately to the review board. She used the word grief. She said it looked like grief. Sincere, quiet, already processed grief, the kind that's had time to settle. He said, she told the board that Brother Ray had been called away. She asked where. He said he didn't know. She asked when. He looked at the sky briefly. She remembered this detail precisely. He looked at the sky as though checking the light and said, recently. She asked to see Claire Ostrander. The man's expression didn't change. He said he didn't know that name either. Morell spent 47 minutes at that gate. She had no warrant. She had no legal basis to enter. She had a badge, a 5-year-old DA protocol designed for narcotics operations, and a note she had written to herself 14 months earlier that she had been right about and had done nothing with. She stood at the open gate of a compound in the San Jacinto Mountains in the thin October air, and she looked at the people moving around inside it, and she could not find, among any of their faces, the man she had been handling for 22 months. She drove back down the mountain. She called Hargrove. She told him Colburn was gone. Hargrove asked if she meant compromised or gone. She said she meant she didn't know which one it was. She said that was the problem. She said that on some level, and she knew how this sounded, and she was putting it in the record anyway. On some level, she wasn't sure anymore that Ray Colburn had disappeared from the covenant of the purified remnant. She was no longer certain he hadn't disappeared with them. 5 days later, Patricia Colburn made her call. And the officer who took it, a 23-year-old deputy named Shane Farley who had been on the job for 7 months, pulled up Ray Colburn's name in the department system and found something that should not have been possible. Something that Farley would describe to his supervisor that same afternoon in a voice that had clearly not yet found its professional register, still raw with the particular shock of encountering something that has no procedure to cover it. Ray Colburn's personnel file had been flagged. Not suspended, not reassigned. Flagged with an access restriction code that Farley had never seen before, that his supervisor had never seen before. That would take 11 hours and 4 escalating phone calls to identify as a code used exclusively by the department's liaison office with the California Department of Justice. Someone above Hargrove knew where Ray Colburn was. And 3 days before Patricia made her call, that someone had used a DOJ liaison code to make sure that anyone who looked for him inside the Riverside County Sheriff's Department would find a door that required a key they didn't have. The question is not whether Ray Colburn was still out there. The question, the one that Patricia Colburn's attorney would spend the next 2 years trying to get answered, the one that Diane Morell would carry in the back of her mind every day until her retirement in 2016, the one that the Internal Review Board ultimately classified under a heading that translates, in bureaucratic language, to no determination could be reached. The question is who put that code in the file, and what they knew and why knowing it was not enough to bring him home. Because on the morning of October 17, 2009, 3 days after Patricia called, 3 days after Farley found the flag, 3 days into what the department was now, quietly, calling a welfare concern rather than a missing persons case, a letter arrived at the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. No return address. Postmarked Anza, California. Hand-addressed in block letters to Sergeant Diane Morell personally. Inside was a single photograph. And Morell, who had spent 22 months reading between the lines of a man's slow erasure, who had learned to hear distress in the word coherence and to read the shape of a person still trying to hold their own name. Morell opened that envelope at her desk, in the middle of an ordinary Thursday morning, and the sound she made brought 4 people running from the corridor. Nobody who was in that room has ever described exactly what was in the photograph. What they have said, what 2 of them said independently to separate interviewers years apart, is that Morell looked at it for a long time before she put it down, that she was very still, and that when she finally spoke, she said only this: "He's not wearing his watch." Ray Colburn had worn the same watch every day for 14 years. His wife had given it to him. He had worn it into the compound. He had been wearing it in every photograph taken during the operations documentation phase on his wrist, always the left wrist, always visible. In that photograph, whatever else was in it, whoever else was in it, wherever it had been taken, Ray Colburn's left wrist was bare. And Diane Morell, who knew this man's habits the way handlers know the habits of people whose survival has briefly depended on your attention, put the photograph down on her desk and said he's not wearing his watch in a voice that meant something far more specific than the words themselves. It meant she knew what the absence of the watch was supposed to communicate to her. It meant he had planned for this. It meant Ray Colburn had known this photograph would be taken. And he had left her a message inside it that told her, with the precision of 14 years of professional trust, exactly one thing about his current situation. And that one thing was the very last piece of information that anyone in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received from the man they had sent into the mountain. The question of what that information was. Is this, that the watch meant he was still Ray Colburn? Sit with that for a moment, because it matters enormously. Diane Morell knew the watch. She knew what it represented. Patricia had given it to him at their 10th anniversary dinner. A Seiko with a navy blue face, modest, nothing flashy, the kind of gift you give someone when you want them to carry time itself as a reminder that they belong to you. Colburn had told Morell about it once, offhandedly, during a debriefing in the early months of the operation, when she had asked him how he maintained separation between his cover identity and himself on the long stints at the compound. He had tapped the watch without thinking. He had not elaborated. He had not needed to. She had written it down anyway. So when Morell looked at that photograph and saw the bare wrist, she understood immediately what Colburn had done, and why he had done it in a way that required no words, no explicit message, nothing that could be intercepted or interpreted by anyone else who might open that envelope before it reached her. He had removed the watch and placed himself in frame, and he was telling her, in the private language of a handler and her asset, something that the surface of the image could never communicate to anyone who didn't already know the code. He had not broken. He was still inside. He was still working. And he needed more time. Morell sat at her desk for 45 minutes after the 4 people ran in from the corridor and confirmed that she was physically intact. She asked them to leave. She looked at the photograph. And then she did something that she would describe to only one person in her lifetime, not to the review board, not to Patricia Colburn's attorney, not to the 2 independent interviewers who spoke to colleagues about her reaction. She would describe it, years later, to her younger sister over a kitchen table in Temecula, long after her retirement, long after most of the people involved had stopped expecting answers. She took the photograph, placed it in her desk drawer, locked it, and did not report it to Hargrove. Because she had understood something else from that envelope. Something she hadn't named to the 4 people standing in her doorway. Something she had barely named to herself. The photograph had been sent to her personally. Hand-addressed. Not to the department, not to the operations official file, not to Hargrove. To Diane Morell by name. Which meant Colburn knew, or had concluded, that somewhere above Hargrove the operation had developed interests that were no longer aligned with Ray Colburn's survival or his extraction. The DOJ liaison flag on his file, placed there 3 days before Patricia even made her call, was not protection. It was containment. Someone had decided that what Ray Colburn knew about the clearing, about Pruitt, about what was happening on those 43 acres, was more valuable inside an ongoing operation than it would ever be in a courtroom. Someone at the California Department of Justice liaison level had looked at the file of a 14-year decorated detective going dark inside a high-control compound and made a calculation. Not about Ray Colburn's welfare. About the intelligence value of keeping the connection alive, even if Colburn himself could no longer be said to be operating in any conventional sense of the word. Operation Hollow Crown, it would later emerge, not through any official disclosure, but through documents obtained by Patricia Colburn's attorney, Marcus Vail, during a civil suit filed in 2011, had been expanded, quietly at a level above Riverside County, in the spring of 2009. What had begun as a county-level investigation into financial crimes, coercion, and the disappearance of Claire Ostrander had attracted the attention of a joint task force examining the movement of money through multiple high-control religious organizations across Southern California, Nevada, and Arizona. The Covenant of the Purified Remnant was not, it turned out, a singular aberration. It was a node. Pruitt was connected, financially, operationally, in ways that the full documents still have not established completely, to a broader network that the task force had been mapping for the better part of 3 years before Operation Hollow Crown ever put Ray Colburn in that function room in Hemet. They had known about the Covenant before Riverside County built their whiteboard. They had been watching. And when an embedded detective appeared in the picture, when an asset was already inside, already trusted, already present on a compound that their own surveillance had never been able to penetrate past the fence line, someone made a decision that was, in its cold strategic logic, entirely comprehensible. They let it run. They flagged the file not to protect Colburn, but to prevent a county-level welfare concern from triggering an extraction that would destroy 2 years of access. They let Patricia call the department. They let Farley find the door he couldn't open. They let Hargrove conduct his assessment phases. They watched from an elevation above all of it, and they calculated that whatever Ray Colburn was experiencing on that mountain was an acceptable cost against the intelligence they were receiving, through channels that the civil suit documents suggest Colburn may not have even known he was feeding. Because here is what Vail's documents showed, and here is where the full picture of what Pruitt had done with his knowledge becomes clear. Pruitt had known Colburn was law enforcement since at least May of 2009. And rather than exposing him or expelling him, Pruitt had made a different choice entirely. He had begun using Colburn, using Ray's position, his access to the compound's inner structures, his deepening integration into the community as a conduit. Not for Colburn's department. For the task force that had been watching from above. Pruitt was cooperating. Had been cooperating, the documents suggest, since some point in 2008. The Covenant of the Purified Remnant was not the target of the expanded operation. It was, at least in part, the instrument of it. David Elias Pruitt, the man with the patient smile and the 2 sealed restraining orders, the man who stood 6'2" and made people feel like rooms had no walls, was working with the government. And he had known that the government had sent Ray Colburn. And the government had known that Pruitt had known. And somewhere in that triangulation of knowledge, Ray Colburn had ceased to be an officer conducting an infiltration and had become something closer to a variable, managed from multiple directions simultaneously, by people none of whom had told him the full shape of what he was standing in the middle of. The watch, then. The photograph. The personal address to Diane Morell. All of it was Colburn doing the only thing left available to someone who has been handled from too many sides and has finally understood the geometry of it. He was not asking for extraction. He was not signaling distress in any way that would trigger a rescue that he'd concluded was not coming. He was creating a record. He was making sure that one person, one specific person whose attention he trusted, knew that he was still himself. Still Ray Colburn, badge number 2247. Still there. Still deliberate. Whatever else was true, whatever was happening on that mountain that the photograph didn't show. He was not gone in the way that the department had permitted themselves to believe. He had not become James Keeler permanently. He had not been absorbed. He was marking his own existence the only way he had left. Claire Ostrander was found in March of 2010. She was alive. She had been relocated, moved from the clearing sometime in October 2009, in the same window of days during which Colburn disappeared, to a property in Maricopa County, Arizona, connected to one of the other organizations the task force had been mapping. She was found during an unrelated welfare check. She was disoriented, physically diminished, and she did not, for the first several weeks of her recovery, use her own name. She eventually recovered enough to provide testimony that contributed to federal proceedings against 3 individuals connected to the network. Proceedings from which David Elias Pruitt was notably, conspicuously, almost inexplicably absent as a defendant. Pruitt surrendered the clearing voluntarily in late 2010. He moved quietly. His current location has never been the subject of a press release. The sealed juvenile record from Kern County, 2003, remains sealed. He has not been charged with any crime in connection with Operation Hollow Crown. Ray Colburn was formally listed as a missing person by Riverside County on November 3, 2009, 3.5 weeks after Patricia made her call, 26 days after Morel had stood at the open gate and found the compound breathing without him. The listing was quiet. It did not generate press. The DOJ liaison code was removed from his personnel file the same day the missing person report was filed, which Vale's civil suit documents describe as, in his careful legal language, a sequence of events that warrants explanation. No explanation has been provided. Patricia Colburn settled the civil suit in 2013 under terms that were sealed at the county's request. She moved with her daughters to Bend, Oregon, the following year. The older daughter, who had called her father James, graduated from university in 2018. She has given no interviews. Diane Morel retired from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department in January 2016. In her retirement remarks, which were brief and which she read from a handwritten card, she said that the job had taught her that the most dangerous thing you could ask of another person was to disappear on your behalf. She said it without context. Nobody in the room who didn't already know what she meant asked her to clarify. The photograph has never been entered into any official record. Morel has never described its contents in any formal setting. Ray Colburn has never been found. But here is the thing that stays with you when you have spent enough time inside this case, when you have read enough of the documents and listened to enough of the people whose lives this operation moved through and rearranged and, in some cases, fundamentally broke. The question the case is usually framed around, where did Ray Colburn go, is not actually the hardest question. The hardest question is the one his wife's sister asked in a recorded interview with Vale's investigative team in 2012, quietly, almost to herself, as though she hadn't meant to say it out loud. She said, "When he took off that watch, was he leaving it behind for a reason? Or was he leaving behind the last thing that would have made it impossible to choose to stay?" Because there are 2 ways to read that bare wrist. There are 2 ways to read a man who has been known completely and handled from every direction, and used by every side, and who has nevertheless survived 22 months in an environment designed to dissolve the boundary between oneself and another. There is the reading in which Ray Colburn removed his watch to send a signal. And there is the reading in which he removed it because what it represented, the life it anchored him to, the people it measured time toward, had become something he could look at clearly from inside that mountain and had decided, with the full weight of a deliberate, functioning mind, he could not go back to carry. We don't know which it is. We may never know. That's not a failure of the investigation, or not only that. It is a consequence of what the operation asked of him, what every person in the chain above him permitted the operation to keep asking, long after any honest accounting should have required them to stop. A man was sent somewhere dark. The people who sent him stopped looking. And the question of whether he found his way back or found something else entirely, and whether there is a meaningful difference between those 2 outcomes, that question belongs now to the silence of the San Jacinto Mountains, and to a desk drawer in a house in Temecula that may or may not still hold a photograph, and to the particular quality of grief on the face of a man at a compound gate who looked at the October sky before he answered. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.